ahoy and welcome to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. This week we're chatting to Richard Armitage. He is an actor, a narrator, and now an author. He's just released his first work of fiction as an audiobook over on Audible. We talk about his routine, most of it's in the planning and then working late. Also how much acting takes the creativity out of his writing, and even when he's plotted it out, how much does he wander from that plan?
If your brain becomes interested in something, I don't stop it. I sort of just go down that little tangent or down that path. And even though, I'm on the wrong track here for this chapter, but I'm going to let it, I'm going to explore it anyway and use it in a different chapter. But there were some chapters that I couldn't wait to write and some that felt like a chore. I needed to do this because it was connective tissue.
There is more with Richard Armitage in this week's Writer's Routine. Yes, welcome to Writer's Routine. This is the show where we take a look inside an author's working day to see how they get stuff done. All types of authors, to see how they plan things out to, both their day, their time, and their idea to give them the best chance of getting it down, getting it published, getting it onto the shelves, or in the case of today's guest, getting it listened to. My name is Dan Simpson. Thank you so much for being there. I'll get it in early. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. If you're listening to this after the big day, I hope you had a very Merry Christmas and you're in line for a brilliant New Year as well. It's an interesting one this week with Richard Armitage for a few reasons. It's always a bit annoying to have to immediately précis an episode with excuses, but just bear with. You'll have noticed that the length of this episode is a tad shorter than normal. That's for a few reasons. You'll note from the state of my voice that I was just coming off the flu, which took away a week or so from you. For some reason as well, our connection was tripe, absolutely terrible. There was a massive delay. I could hardly hear what Richard was saying, but I have managed to salvage what I think is a pretty good chat about writing. But if it does suddenly hop about, if there is a random edit that you spot, that'll be why. I've made it as clean as possible, and I think it works, and it is worth cracking on with it because he's a very interesting guest. Richard Armitage is an actor who has been in, the Hobbit series of films. You might know him from the Harlan Coben Netflix thrillers as well. He was in The Stranger and Stay Close, and he's got his first work of fiction out as an Audible audiobook. It's called Geneva. We talk about how the project came to be. You can hear that in detail. The shortened version is that he is one of the Audible listeners' favourite narrators. Everything that he reads for them gets heavily downloaded, so Audible asked him to come up with something new. Originally they wanted it to be ghostwritten, but he worked on a treatment, he got down a few chapters, and the rest was his. And I really enjoy, with this podcast, chatting to all different forms of writers who have managed to get stuff out there. We've chatted to a lot of debut authors this year, which I think has been incredibly worthwhile. It's always good to hear how different people have got their stuff to you. This is called Geneva. It's a psychological thriller which follows the scientist Sarah Collier and her husband Daniel as they travel to a global conference, and only on their arrival do they realise they're actually pawns in a high-stakes game with many hidden players. Now, I'm always a bit wary of chatting to celebrity authors on the show, especially in the current climate, particularly with children's fiction. I think it's always worth bearing in mind the merit of it. But Richard has written it, and I was curious about the process, about splitting his time with acting, if that creatively exhausts him, about the different places he wrote in hotels around the world, perhaps even on set. You can hear also how, looking back over his drafts, he can spot what kind of mood he was in when he wrote that bit. Also, how a lot of his routine was in thinking over beforehand and then working late. Whether because he'd worked with the master of these kind of psychological thrillers, if he sought out Harlan Coben's advice at all. And I will say as well, there were many, many more questions that I wanted to ask him, but because of the aforementioned connection issue, I didn't get the chance. But I think there's a lot to take away, And Richard's got a fantastic voice, and it's always worth hearing from different authors. So let's get to it. Talking about Geneva, and we kick things off with what Richard Armitage sees in the place around him where he sits down to write.
What do I see around me? Okay, I wrote in so many different places. I saw a lot of the inside of a hotel room, I've got to be honest.
Was there anything kind of...
Is that what you meant?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah. It's amazing how it works differently for different people. Was there anything kind of consistent amongst your space in the hotel room, or was it just have laptop, will travel?
It was literally that, have laptop, will travel. But I have to say I was in Seville, Madrid, Rome, Manchester. So I was getting inspired by lots of different places. So it's interesting when you then look back over what you've written and you think, oh, I can tell where I was right there because I was clearly in a good mood that day.
So it's you and your laptop. What is there practical kind of on the laptop that draws you towards what you're meant to be writing that day? Do you have like a notes folder? Is there post-it notes that you bring out? Maybe a little notebook?
I had a little black notebook by my bed, which I would jot down anything that came up in my dreams. On the laptop, I mean, I sort of flicked between iPad and laptop. So I was writing in Ulysses and then transferring it to Word, and it was that all of the technology stuff was a bit of a headache, to be honest, because I'd rather write with pen and paper, but that's just not possible. So, to be honest, I do have a brain that can retain a lot. So I did a hell of a lot of thinking, and then would write it at the end of when I'd organized it in my head. So yeah, that was a bit of process.
We get quite nerdy, I think, for want of a better phrase, on the show. Quite a lot of people listening like to know what font you write with. God
knows. I have no idea. I think it kept changing, but whatever the default was, sorry.
No, you'd be surprised. I've spoken to authors who like to edit in a different font because it makes them see things that maybe they didn't before. I don't know if that's something.
I need to pick up those tricks. That's a really good idea.
All right. Well, talk to us about your writing routine then. I'm interested because, as a working actor, and you've already said that you're writing all around the world in these different hotel rooms. How did a writing day look like for you? Were you cramming it into free gaps you had in filming? Just take us through the moment you wake up to the moment you went to bed on a day when you were writing this story. How did it look?
You know what? I'd done quite a lot of work in the planning process. So because I knew that I was going to be working on other projects. So I'd written a really detailed full breakdown of the entire book, and each chapter had a little paragraph about who was in it, what needed to happen, and how we were going to do it. Like in sort of maybe 5 lines. So I was usually writing on either days off or at the weekends. So I would have a look at the little paragraph which told me what I was going to be tackling, usually the night before. So I'd have an idea in my head because, and this is something I do with acting as well. I'll look at the scene the last thing before I sleep, and then all kinds of weird stuff comes up in your dreams or it organizes itself in your brain. So I'd get up in the morning and again read the paragraph about what I was supposed to do, then probably go and eat and then go for a run. And again, like I said, do a lot of organizing in my head. So I think because I see things very visually, in a way I was imagining the movie of this book. So I would sort of riff on what was going to happen in the chapter, which would get broken down into various scenes. And then I'd come back and sometime in the afternoon, I'd start trying to write it down and sort of organize it, on the page or on the screen. And I would just keep going like free flow. So sometimes I'd find myself, it'd be like 2 a.m. and I just couldn't stop because you have to get it out. But the most satisfying thing I found was coming back to it. Maybe I'd leave it for the next day, come back to it a couple of days later and really go back over what I'd written and, start polishing and editing. And you realize, you do need to have that free flow where you don't check yourself too much. I just used to let it all come out
It's interesting. I speak to many authors on the show who set themselves a word count. You know, they might aim to get down 1,000 words a day. And the idea of sitting there for hours on end, just typing and bashing it out in this state of free flow might be quite tough for them. Was there any part of you that wishes maybe you had more organisation in what you were able to write? I know that that's not always doable because of work, but if you'd have been able to sit there and say, right, I'm going to get 1,000 words done today, how much would that have impacted the way you wrote the story, do you think?
You know, I did have a rough idea of what my word count needed to be per chapter, but I realised I had to disobey that thing, because if I either was not getting there or I was way over, I didn't want to restrict what was coming out. So more often than not, I would probably write about 1,500 to 2,000 words too many. But then that made the editing thing much more satisfying, because you just start to take away the stuff that you don't need, knowing that the chapter was going to be actually like, you know, cooking down a sauce. You know, you get it really rich and concentrated. And sometimes, you know, I would write something that I would then remove and just put it into my little slush bucket and use it later, because I'd probably written it in the wrong place. But you know, it's a little bit like, I mean, and I do this with preparing for any character. If your brain becomes interested in something, I don't stop it. I sort of just go down that little tangent or down that path. And even though, you know, I'm on the wrong track here for this chapter, but I'm going to let it, you know, I'm going to explore it anyway and use it in a different chapter. But there were some chapters that I couldn't wait to write, and some that felt like a chore. I needed to do this because it was connective tissue. The process of acting is interesting because it's quite slow and ponderous, and you do a lot of waiting around. And without trying, my brain will just fill up with ideas of things I'd like to do in the scene that you then get to try. But also, knowing that I had something else simmering on the stove, which was my book, my writing, I quite liked the it's a bit like drawing off excess liquid, is that if I didn't explore something during the day, I could get it out on, you know, with my, you know, with the words in the thing that I was writing. So I can really tell where I was in the year by looking at parts of the book and thinking, oh, I know where I was there, and I know what's informing this. So rather than it be, I don't get that, the creative exhaustion. I mean, sometimes you do need to switch off, which is why I'd say that I do a lot of thinking rather than disciplined, like I have to get this down. You know, and until I was ready to write, because if you're forcing yourself to do anything creative, it's always going to feel slightly forced. But I wouldn't write until I was ready to write.
On days when the words weren't coming to you easily, Richard, is there anything that you learned along the way to just help them out? Anything that might grease the cogs of potential writer's block, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's very similar to trying to learn lines. You know, there is a structured discipline that you just do, even if it's not going in. So I would structure the chapter that I was writing with the A to B, like the dot to dot of what needed to happen so that the next chapter could occur. And I would just have holding things where I would leave a slight gap going, I know I'm going to fill this in later with something creative and inspirational, but I would at least get the skeleton down. And call it done. And there were some chapters that I just left unwritten, and I would say to the editor, I know I've got to go back in and write this one. I'll do it when I've found what I need. So the thing is, I'm quite used to that, because with acting, you shoot out of sequence. So I actually found it quite easy to just write a chapter from the end, or go back and do something from the beginning, and keep all of the pieces in my head, so that if something was in the beginning, I could just shift it over and know that I was going to use it later down the line. So yeah, having the skeleton in place was really useful for that.
Now, just the way that this project has come about is quite different from the way many people listening will think publishing is done. So you had narrated quite a lot of stories exclusively for Audible, and now you've written a story which you're also narrating on Audible. Could you just tell us, I guess, how the project came together? Because it's always interesting to hear how not every publishing story is exactly the same.
Yeah. Out of the blue, Audible came to me, or through my agent, and said, "Would Richard be interested in writing a crime thriller?" And I think they'd obviously looked at a lot of the data that they have on who was listening to my words, to my work as a reader, and where my voice was sort of fitting into the amount of reading that I do for them. And I do have quite a broad selection of styles of writing, but they said we think this might be quite a good idea. And, I immediately said, yeah, I'd love to write something. And then they said, well, it will be audio only. So I thought that was appropriate. And then the word ghostwriter came up, and I felt like, because I was going to be speaking these words, they wanted me to write something that I would read as a character. So I had to write myself into my own story, if you see what I mean. I couldn't be reading someone else's words, pretending they were mine. So I absolutely said, no ghostwriter, I'm going to do this. So the experiment that they threw out became a little bit more precarious, because they were like, we don't even know if he can write yet. So I submitted a writing sample to them and my plot idea, which they were thrilled with. And then we started to develop it together. So I worked with an editor on the story structure, and that process again is a little bit like acting. Is you spend a lot of time asking questions, and then my job was to try and answer them to make that story as dynamic and streamlined as possible. And then, like I say, we created the structure, and then I started writing. But it's interesting writing, knowing that things are going to change, things are going to move, things are going to be filtered out. So I never threw anything away. I kept everything in different boxes to draw on later. Without effort and without realizing it, what I was doing was imagining this story as my TV show or my miniseries or movie, picturing each scene, each moment, each chapter, and then just going and writing it down. So understanding that my brain works in a very visual way. I always knew this. When I work on scripts as an actor, I my margins are just full of images and pictures, and I'm a very visual storyteller creatively. So I basically made the movie in my head and then wrote it down, which again is very satisfying. But it meant that I had to go to the place that I was writing about to see it, just to find accuracy and detail. But I found myself talking to my editor in terms of scenes and cuts and things like that. But that was really the process.
We'll be back with more from Richard and my fluey, scraggly voice in just a second. Just want to point you towards our Patreon page quickly. If you're enjoying the show, if you like what we do, if you gain any insights, any advice on how to get your idea down, if we've helped out at all, you can always support the show at patreon.com/writers routine. I really, really appreciate anything that you can sling our way. It's a one-man operation. That man is me. I do everything, which is why it's been a bit higgledy-piggledy recently, and I really appreciate you carrying on. If you are a Patreon, you being there, you supporting the show, a little goes an extraordinarily long way. It helps us carry on going, keep bringing you these chats with the best authors around as often as we can. Until this month, I hadn't missed a Friday in a long old time. So I really appreciate it. For that, you get our thanks, you get merch, there is bonus content, there is even a way for your book to sponsor this show. And I will emphasise, I know times are incredibly tight at the moment, so if you can sling anything my way, I am eternally grateful to you for doing that, for you becoming a backer, for you supporting the show, helping us carry on doing this podcast at patreon.com/writers routine. Let's get back to it then with Richard Armitage, actor, narrator, and now author. He's worked on Shakespeare, he's worked in the Hobbit series, he's worked in the Harlan Coben Netflix thrillers, probably more recently, that's where you might know him from. And we're talking about his new audiobook, I was going to say book or novel, but that's not quite what it is. There is a chance that it'll be printed, and we'll hear about that in a little bit. But the new audiobook through Audible is called Geneva. He's written it after being asked by Audible to work on something for the listeners that love hearing his voice. We talk about working on TV drama and what that taught him about writing plot. Also, the idea he had for Geneva, writing it with a lot of different voices, a lot of different actors in mind. And we pick things up chatting about how it was different writing for an audiobook rather than a novel that was then turned into an audiobook.
The process was different because I did read every single word out loud to make sure that it was right musically, structurally. But towards the end, of course, the same process happened with Audible. There was a copy editor that made sure all the grammar was correct and pretty to look at, and it was formatted well because, although it is primarily for audio at the moment, it may turn into a physical book further down the line. So we did go through all that process. I mean, in a way, it's a bit like notating music, because without all of that punctuation, grammar, and everything in place, the readers that were reading the other characters, it's a bit like a score. You have to give them that instruction of how I was hearing it in terms of pause and pace and all of those kinds of things. But certainly in the recording room, I was hitting a couple of moments where I just thought, this isn't right. I've got to use a different word here, or it didn't flow. It just one or two places. So I still was editing right at the last minute and retrofitting the final draft a little bit.
So let's talk about the actual story then. This is Geneva, and from what you've said so far, it's interesting because you're writing in many more dimensions than something that is made only to be read on the page. You've been approached by Audible. You don't want the ghostwriter. You want to write yourself. Tell us about the first moment that the idea for what would become Geneva came into your brain.
I read a lot of audiobooks, a lot of other people's literature, and I also have listened to quite a few, and I sort of understand my own taste, and I try to tap into what people want from an audiobook. And I knew that I wanted this to be spoken in first person. I'd read Jekyll and Hyde for Audible, and I really loved the idea of a kind of doctor's thesis about somebody who was, mentally unwell. And obviously in Jekyll and Hyde, he's writing about himself. So that was really my first idea, that I was going to write the character of Daniel Collier, who was describing a case study that turned out to be his wife. And then I thought, well, she's the nucleus of the story, and all of the kind of mental torture that she's going through, I'd like that to be experienced in first person as well. So I wrote both of the protagonists in first person. And I took inspiration from Sarah Gilbert, who was very much in the news, with the AstraZeneca vaccine at the time. And I just thought, I'll use the idea of a brilliant scientist who starts to experience problems with her own mental health, just as a foundation stone for who that woman was going to be. And then I just started to experiment with, the character of Daniel was a lecturer, so I wanted him to talk to his students and to the audience at the same time.
And you're writing in a genre. I mean, we've spoken about Harlan Coben, and we've spoken about other forms of psych thriller, but that's how you're writing. How much were you thinking about, I guess, playing the game of the genre that you're writing in terms of words on the page, what you're actually writing, how you're structuring your chapters, and leaving red herrings and leaving short chapters that you want to quickly jump to the next one? How much were you thinking about that, Richard?
When I first started, I really wasn't thinking about the genre at all. And I was relying on my editor, who's very experienced in that field, to guide me. On a personal taste level, I really was very conscious of cheating the audience. So red herrings can really be a problem for me. They trouble me, and I get very frustrated, certainly in terms of TV drama. There are certain writers and directors that do it very well, and some others that you get very frustrated at the end, and you think, wait a second, I've spent all this time, all of this investment, and this is going nowhere. So I was really conscious of that, but at the same time, I also don't like things that are too tied up neatly and over-explained. I think there's room for enigma in this genre. So I was finding a balance of all of those things, but understanding what the set pieces needed to be was important, and I also had to swallow a bigger pill, I suppose, with my villain, because I was making her too nuanced, and it was almost like this character just needs to be black and white, psycho, in order to make the story work. But I still think it's important, and I'm creating another treatment right now, and it's making everything as believable as possible. Just any twist or any cliffhanger was explicable and understand, to be understood, but without cheating the audience.
And that is it for this week's episode of Writer's Routine. Thank you to Richard Armitage for coming on the show. He's obviously a very busy man, so I really appreciate that time. Also, a huge thank you to you for cracking on with that. I know it was a slightly different episode, so I really appreciate your time in listening. That new Audible audiobook by Richard is called Geneva, and you can get it right now. Thank you so much for listening to the show this year. I will see you back in January 2023. With another episode of the podcast. We've got more fantastic authors on the way. You can support us at patreon.com/writers routine. Drop us a tweet at writerspod. Follow us on there. And if there's anything you want to say, you want to get in touch, use the contact form over at writersroutine.com. It's really easy. And you might have heard my cat meowing in the background because I've locked her out of the room. I need to go and let her in. Have a very Merry Christmas and a fantastic New Year. And I will see you in 2023. Until then, bye.